those of you that don't know me, and I know some people on the call I do know, and I have indeed one of them I spoke to last week. I'm John James, and I'm the Chief Officer at the Sickle Cell Society. And I'm here today to tell you a bit about our work and a bit about sickle cell. And I hope you'll find it interesting. If you've had any questions or indeed comments, then let us know. Next one, please. So this is just sometimes people big up themselves, but I want people to know that the Sickle Cell Society has been around for over 40 years as a national charity, championing the cause for sickle cell services, better sickle cell services. And in 2018, this was us, well before COVID, winning the 2018 GSK King's Fund Impact Awards. So, our work is recognised by external people about making a difference to the sickle cell community. It's hard work. Next slide, please. So, who is the Sickle Cell Society? Well, as I said, we were set up in 1979 as a registered charity. We were operating before then, but in terms of charity status, that was secured in 1979. The Sickle Cell Society was formed by a group of patients, people who lived with sickle cell, parents who had children with sickle cell, and health professionals. That's nurses, doctors, and professions allied to medicine. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of those people because they're still around. And why was the society set up? Well, it was set up to address, way back in the 70s and before the 70s, there was a complete lack of understanding and inadequacy of treatment for people who lived with sickle cell. So people would go to hospital in the 70s and health professionals wouldn't know what they're dealing with. So that's how the Sickle Cell Society came about. And we want to be successful. We've been around for 40 plus years, and we work nationally, but I have to tell you internationally as well. We get people from the United States, and I know there are some colleagues from the United States on the call today. We get groups from the United States, the Caribbean, Africa, contacting us and seeking information and using our resources. So in the UK, we have a network of support groups and supporters. Not everybody's in a support group, but supporters who we link in with. So next slide. So what is it that we're about? Well, we do a number of things because we're quite unusual. We do a lot about policy, and that's about advancing public education and awareness about sickle cell, but we do that in policy terms. We provide respite recreation specifically for children, and that's a picture of us taking 30 children away. This is pre-COVID, for a camp to learn about their sickle cell and meet other children, because there are not every child has a sibling who has sickle cell or is a carrier, more of which I'll explain later. And we provide bespoke support for individuals and their families on any range of matters. It could be housing, it could be education, it could be anything. It could be issues with their employer, and so forth. So that's what we do on a day-to-day basis, and we're very busy as a consequence. Next one, please, Mark. Now, I'm sharing something with you about South London Gives because it's a pilot project. So it's specifically in South London, where obviously there are lots of people who live with sickle cell or are healthy carriers. And although we are primarily an organisation that is focused on sickle cell, we are doing work with the National Health Service Blood and Transplant Organisation to increase the number of black people, and we're talking black people now, not, they have to be black and brown people, to donate blood. And why we're doing that, because we can easily make the connection about why blood donation is important for people who live with sickle cell, because one of the treatments, which I'll talk about later, is about regular blood transfusions for people who live with sickle cell. Not everybody has blood transfusions, but it's really important. And the reality is that there is not enough of us who donate blood. So Tracy Williams leads that work, and I have to say we're doing really great things with that and increasing the number. And that's really been difficult during the pandemic and lockdown, but the numbers are getting better, and we're continuing that work in 2021, 2022. So that's just an example of, if you like, associated work that the organisation does, but linked back to sickle cell. So keep going, please. And briefly on this, I said we provide advice, information, and we run a helpline service. It's through the phone, email, social media, and we give advice on managing sickle, social and welfare issues, signposting, and just helping everybody. And our helpline is really busy. It's Monday to Friday, it's really busy. And two spikes that we had recently, because of COVID and what COVID means for sickle, there was a huge spike in emails, telephone calls about people worried about sickle cell and COVID, but I'll say a bit more about that. But again, that's just an example of the service that we provide to support individuals who just want to talk to us about issues that they may be experiencing. Next slide, Mark. So, having said all of that, just a brief, really simple explanation about what sickle cell disorder is. We tend to use the term disorder rather than disease. Doctors like the term disease, but at the end of the day, it's a blood disorder. So we tend to prefer using sickle cell disorder rather than sickle cell disease. And what it is, it's a group of hemoglobinopathy conditions which are inherited. So, it's passed on by parents. And I say parents plural because, some people say, well, it can't be my side of the family. It's got to be your side of the family. Well, actually, it's both parents. So it's not, when I say it's genetic, it's both parents are involved in passing on the sickle genes. And there are white blood cells, but this affects red blood cells. In simple terms, the hemoglobin is what passes all the way through your body, carries oxygen to different parts of your body. What happens when you have sickle cell disorder is those blood cells become sickle shaped. So it's very simple. They come sickle shaped, look like a banana, and they're not like the normal red blood cell. They're sticky, and therefore what happens is when they're carrying oxygen around the body, because they're sticky and not fully formed, some are, but not all of them are, like normal red blood cells, they get stuck in the blood vessels. And when they get stuck in the blood vessels, it causes the most excruciating pain. And it's an invisible pain because, whether you're a child, an adult, and you're in pain, nobody can see necessarily that pain. And think about it. If there is no oxygen going to your brain, you're going to have a stroke. So the crisis, as it's called, can be in any part of the body, and so that people with sickle cell have to deal with episodic pain crisis, and there are reasons why those crises are triggered, and I'll say more about that later. But importantly, it also causes serious health complications for adults and children over time. I say there's no cure yet because, of course, there is a cure, but I'll explain. So when I say no cure yet, I put that tongue in cheek because there is something called a bone marrow transplant or gene therapy, which is the latest thing. But bone marrow transplants are complicated, and the mortality rate, whilst getting better, in my view, is still, a little too high, in my opinion. So it is getting better, but my view is that whilst bone marrow transplants are getting better, the mortality rate and the complications associated with transplantation are complex. And I'll explain why later. And then, of course, there are people in our community who have sickle cell trait. So what does sickle cell trait means? It simply means that these are healthy carriers. So they don't have episodic pain crisis. So they'll have normal red blood cells, and they're carriers. And effectively, if two carriers meet and decide to have children, then they have a 1 in 4 chance of having a child with sickle cell disorder. Let's say they have 4 children, okay? One of them might be a child with sickle cell disorder, the other 3 might be carriers. It could be any other configuration, but there's always, it's 1 in 4 and only 1 in 4 chance of having a child. And of course, there's lots and lots and lots of people out there who are healthy carriers of the sickle cell gene. Next one, Mark, please. So I think I've covered this one because sometimes when people talk about sickle cell, they talk about AA or SC and SS. So what that means when you hear people talking about sickle in those terms is that red blood cells with normal hemoglobin is AA, keep their shape when they release oxygen, and when they are sickled, it's usually SSSC, and I'll explain some of the other ones. So that's what causes the pain. Next one, please. And here is an example. So you would expect that that's where it gets blocked. So if you've got normal blood cells, they just flow all the way around the body, carrying the oxygen. And here is an example on the bottom of this slide where there's no oxygen passing through the body, and that's what causes the pain and long-term damage. Next one, please. So how is it diagnosed? How is sickle diagnosed? Well, one thing I just want to big up the Sickle Cell Society for is that in the 80s, there was not a universal screening program. And in this country, I think we should be proud that we have a universal screening program for sickle cell, which was introduced in the 80s. So today, any parent or parents that are they'll have screening through amnio when they're expecting. They could do it through cord blood, but everyone will have, mothers will have an informed choice. They know that they're pregnant. They know there's a chance of the child having sickle cell. And by and large, that's what the evidence says. Most parents go through with their pregnancies. So there's now a universal screening program It was fully formed in 2003, but operating previously. In other parts of the world, like France, where there's lots of sickle cell, they've got screening programs, but they're not as universal as the UK, and in parts of the Caribbean, Africa, the Middle East, Brazil. Again, they're very ad hoc. So so now we know every child. Don't know their names, obviously, but we've got the numbers of all children born with sickle, and we've also got the numbers who are healthy carriers. Next one, please. And I mentioned earlier, normal blood cells are termed by doctors and nurses, and indeed some patients, as AA and SS, so sickle cell anemia. So that's the disorder where you're prone to regular crisis. So SS. So there's not one type of sickle cell. This is what this slide is illustrating. So HB is short for hemoglobin, not hemoglobin. Okay. So hemoglobin SS is the most serious of the disorders. You can have hemoglobin SC, which is still a disorder that you'll have episodic. You can have hemoglobin SD. You can have HBE. You can also, some of you might have heard of a condition called thalassemia. You can have beta thalassemia and sickle. So it isn't just one form of anemia. The most common, though, the most common internationally is SS. So next one, please. I think inheritance I've covered by saying, giving you the example of two healthy carriers, and this is just a slide that illustrates the inheritance route. Just interestingly, not in terms of inheritance, but there is some evidence that says that way back in history, when people who first had sickle cell, it was a protection against malaria. Now, things have changed over centuries, so we always advise people to get their malaria shots and don't think, well, I've got sickle cell, so I'm not going to get malaria. But there is evidence that in the early days it was a protection against malaria. So next one, Mark. So sickle, what brings on this blockage? So this is an unpredictable condition. You can be well on Monday morning and ill on Monday evening because it's an unpredictable condition. But here are some examples of things that can trigger a sickle cell crisis. And again, a sickle cell crisis is when you're in pain that in most often than not requires a hospital admission. So for children particularly, because we've had lots of complaints from parents over the years about children, drinking when they're in class, drinking water, that is, when they're in class. So inadequate fluid intake. So if you're not, properly hydrated, that's going to bring on a crisis. We've even had complaints about, children going regularly to the toilet because they're drinking lots of water. And that's just an illustration of some teachers not understanding sickle cell in the classroom. Extremes of cold and heat. So if it's really cold, that can trigger a crisis. If it's really hot, that can trigger a crisis as well. Infections, flu, viral infections, COVID, physical exhaustion. So, and this is why we take children away to learn about their condition, because some of them can't partake in PE or swimming in the same way as some of their peers in the class might be. So physical exhaustion and extreme exercise. And just give you an example of extreme exercise. We had 2 deaths last year. I think they were army. These were army cadets. They didn't have sickle. They were carriers. Interestingly, they were carriers. The army did not know they were carriers because they recruited these young black men from overseas, you know, former territories of Commonwealth, and this is extreme exercise. This isn't just a park run, extreme exercise, and they died. So we're working with the Ministry of Defence at the moment to say, you know, if you're recruiting overseas recruits, you need to make sure that you understand their sickle status. So that can cause stress and anxiety. Now we all get stressed sometimes for one reason or another. But stress and anxiety can bring on a crisis. So keep going, Mark. Thank you. And here's an interesting slide because a little did you know fact. Sickle cell is this country's, the UK's, biggest genetic blood condition. It is also the biggest genetic blood condition in the world. Nevertheless, it doesn't get the attention it deserves. So I'm not knocking cystic fibrosis for, you know, because it's a terrible condition. But sickle cell and cystic fibrosis are similar in that they're genetic and they're blood, you know, they relate to the blood. And sickle cell outstrips cystic fibrosis by at least a third. But most people know about cystic fibrosis. It's also a hugely wealthy charity and so forth. So I make that illustration not to knock people who have cystic fibrosis, but just to make the point. And I would argue, and people can disagree with me, but I would argue it has something to do with the demographics of who gets what. That is certainly my view. So there are approximately 15,000 people in the UK who live with sickle cell disorder. Those are people who, and that's adults and children. The big areas where it's more concentrated is obviously London, the Midlands, the Northwest, where you are, Bristol in the Southwest. So let's put it this way: it's not like, you know, where black people have been for centuries, there is sickle cell. But in Cumbria, in Suffolk, in Norfolk, there are people who live with sickle cell. What's changed over the years is that there are high prevalence areas with sickle cell and there are low prevalence areas with sickle cell. So there are parts of the country like Cumbria, like Suffolk and Norfolk, where traditionally it's not where, you know, black communities have settled, but they are now. So it's all across the UK. We think it's slightly more than 15,000, and the reason we say that is that we know from our helpline and work we do that there are some individuals who are not on registers, who don't want to be on registers. They might have leave to remain issues and stuff like that. So we think it's slightly high. It could be as high as 17 or 18,000. But there's a cohort who just don't want to be on any system. There's over 2 million worldwide. And obviously, it's most common in people whose family origin are from Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, India, the Mediterranean, North Cyprus. So it is truly a global condition. Brazil, plenty sickle cell. India, plenty sickle cell. The Middle East, plenty sickle cell. Europe, France has got about the same numbers as us. Holland, Germany, Portugal, because Portugal was used to enslave people in its heyday. So this is a truly global condition. But not exclusively is that there are white people who have sickle cell, and there are white people who are healthy carriers of sickle cell. And I remember giving a talk to a group of, the NHS sometimes get people from overseas to come and support. And I was giving a chat to some Eastern European nurses, and I said 1 in every 300,000 white UK births today is a white baby who is born with sickle cell. And one of the questions in the audience, Mr. James, where's your evidence? You have to give us some evidence to say that white people get sickle cell. So I said, I've got the evidence because we've got a universal screening program, and we know how many children are born each year with sickle cell and what their ethnic status is. And the nurse who said, look, I honestly didn't know that. I always thought sickle cell only affected black people. So there you go. I don't have it on this slide, but I did have a picture of a great grandmother with sickle who is my complexion, and her great granddaughter was white or mixed race. So you can see, the demographics change. Next one, Mark, please. So how is it treated? Blood transfusion, you can have regular blood transfusion, and I mentioned why we do the work about encouraging more black people to donate blood. The pain relief is on admission to hospital. So, if you are admitted to hospital, and by the way, if you want another did you know fact, sickle cell in England is in the top 17 of all causes for emergency hospital admission. So it's in the top 20 of all reasons why people end up as an emergency in any hospital in the country. And if you do end up in hospital, you're given strong painkillers. It isn't paracetamol. We're talking about ketamine, morphine, and there are big issues about how some young men and women are stereotyped because they're in pain. They might have been in hospital earlier that week and then back again. And sometimes the healthcare professionals think, oh, come on, John, you're back here for another shot of ketamine or morphine or something. So that's where the pain medication usually takes place. Hydroxyurea is the only, imagine, sickle cell has been known about for over 100 years medically. So it's been known about, people have won Nobel Prizes to work out the kind of science of the disease. But in 2021, there is only one licensed treatment, which is hydroxyurea. Hydroxyurea is a chemotherapy drug. It wasn't invented for sickle. There is good evidence that it does improve the frequency of crisis, and so there's good evidence for that. But it's a toxic. So if you're on sickle, whether you're male or female, and are thinking of having a family, you have to stop taking hydroxyurea at least 6 months before, because of its toxic ingredients. And I'll say more about the future, because this, in my view, is outrageous that there should only be one treatment for sickle cell. Bone marrow transplant has been available, and I've covered that. And again, thanks to the Sickle Cell Society, bone marrow transplants were only given to children, not adults. Adults who wanted a transplant had to pay for it themselves. We've now agreed with NHS England that there should be a policy to fund adult transplantation. But NHS England's caveat was that anybody who is an adult, they have to have a sibling donor. So, which is not what we wanted, because there are some people with sickle who don't have a sibling. And then Doppler screening is a diagnostic tool. It's not a treatment, it's a diagnostic tool, and particularly for children, which identifies if they're going to have a stroke, because by the time a child is 12, he or she will have had 2 silent strokes. So they have regular diagnostic scanning to prevent stroke. Next one, please, Mark. We're getting there, so I'll be finished in a moment. Here are some complications. Iron overload, that is just too much iron in the system from treatments and drugs. Organ damage over time. So it's not uncommon for a person who has sickle cell in their late 20s, early 30s to have a hip replacement because of damage done. There's a word for it, and I can't remember it. Aneurysms, eye issues, hypertension, all are impacts of sickle cell. Next one's, because I think I've got a better slide that illustrates it. Here we are. Sickle has complications for all parts of the body: stroke, neurocognitive problems, pulmonary hypertension, and if you're having a really serious stroke, it's the equivalent of a heart attack. And that's what acute chest syndrome is. Gallstones, you have to, spleen problems. The word that I was looking for about hip replacement is that a common complication is a vascular necrosis of the hip, and kidney failure, leg ulcers are all common. Now, this one is only for men, which is priapism. And it's important to talk about priapism because little boys don't want to talk about priapism. And little boys who don't talk about it, it's a serious condition which usually ends up in hospital. So priapism is a painful erection. And boys get it, but they don't want to talk to mum or dad about it because it's embarrassing. But if it's not treated, it is very serious. So we encourage young boys to talk about it so they can get treated. But I think this gives you a sort of picture of the effect. And in addition to the health complications, young people and adults can have some psychosocial issues with sickle cell, the sort of why me syndrome and not my brother or my sister, or I can't do everything that my friends can do when it comes to sports. And, and if you're, we're all being teenagers, going out smoking and drinking and all of that isn't a good idea if you have sickle cell. Next one, Mark. We're coming to the end, so. And, I mentioned the importance of good diet, about temperatures, about de-stressing, about support from family, friends, smoking, too much alcohol, rest and warmth. So there are things that, we advise people to do to keep themselves well and healthy. Next one. COVID. So I wanted to cover COVID because COVID is new, nobody knew what impact COVID was having on people who lived with sickle cell. And we were really worried because, as I explained earlier, if you can pick up viral infections and that could lead to crisis. We've been working with every centre in the UK who deals with sickle cell, and they've been collecting data on admissions of people with COVID and sickle. So it's a real-time national survey of hemoglobinopathy, so that's sickle, thalassemia, and other rare anemia. And the good news, and that's been going since March of last year when the pandemic started, and the good news is that 97% of people with sickle survived it. Okay, that's really good news. So I guess we were pleased about that. The other important thing is that very few children have been infected, which mirrors the national picture. Of course, children have been infected, but very, very few. And of those that were infected, they didn't require respiratory support. And importantly, none of them have died. So that's similar to what we have seen. Obviously, some people have died, but the vast majority have survived with no fatalities for children. Of course, children have died, but unrelated to COVID. Next one, please. And I mean, this is just how we work hard, but keep in touch with us. And I was just addressing that to Una and Mark. Anybody, keep in touch with us. Become a member. It's free membership. You get lots of information about what's happening in the world around sickle cell. So if you're not a member, sign up. You can follow us on Facebook. So it's not all about fundraising, because not everybody can fundraise, and not everybody has funds to support us. But there are other ways of supporting us, like becoming a member, like following us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and telling your friends on social media. And that's why I'm so pleased that Mark and Una have given me the opportunity to share the information about sickle on the Pursuit of Happiness platform. So we're virtually there. Next one. And that's how you can get in touch with us. So I'll leave that there. I've covered a lot of ground there, but hopefully I've covered that ground in simple, plain English, and it's given you a better understanding of the work we do, and how we support people, and giving you a bit of insight into sickle cell as well. So I hope you found that informative and helpful. And again, thank you for your patience in listening to me. So happy to take questions, comments, discussion, and over to you.